Hi everyone. We're going to try to have a voiceover here of my PowerPoint so we can pretend that we were actually in class as we go through chapter 9 in your text this week, which has to do with school law and everything related to your rights and responsibilities as teachers and the rights of students, and then some rights and responsibilities that parents have as well. This will be done over several parts because I can only record about 15 minutes per segment. So we're going to start today by talking about 4 sources of school law. So when schools make their laws, there are kind of 4 places or things that they look back to try to kind of give them some guidance as to what to do. So the first one we're going to talk about has to do with the U.S. Constitution. So if you just want to put a number 1 on this one, the U.S. Constitution we've talked about briefly before in class, and there are a couple of things related to the U.S. Constitution that have to do with this school law discussion. The first one has to do with the preamble to the Constitution. If anyone's ever read the preamble or remembers the preamble, that's that phrase that starts, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." And then it goes on to talk about basically the general welfare of those living in the United States. So this has to really do with school law and rights because it deals with schools promoting the general welfare for all. Another piece to this is the First Amendment, which has to do with freedom of religion and speech. There are many, many issues that arise in schools having to do with religion as well as free speech. So this amendment is often looked at when those issues arise in schools. Another piece under the Constitution is the Fourth Amendment. And this amendment actually has to do with protecting basic privacy and security rights. So a lot of things come up when we talk about the Fourth Amendment in schools, things like locker searches, things that have to do with rights of students. And so we'll be talking more about that when we talk about rights of students, but just so you know where it came from, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And then the last piece under the Constitution has to do with the 14th Amendment, which protects a person's right to due process, where we cannot deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without a fair decision-making process. What this really has to do with related to schools is if there is an issue with a student, let's say, for example, being suspended, then this particular amendment comes into play where if the student was given, there was an investigation and then the parents were called and the students were given some sort of time and forum to actually discuss what actually occurred, then that would be considered due process instead of just being suspended. So we refer back often to the 14th Amendment for various policies that schools make. The second basis of school law has to do with federal laws. If you take a look at this slide real quick, this particular slide contains a lot of things we've already discussed in the earlier part of the semester. The first piece is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically said students couldn't be excluded from different activities based on race, color, or national origin. It actually didn't relate just to schools because it was really relating to programs that were receiving federal financial assistance, any programs in the country. But when it came to schools, this referred to, again, allowing students all students opportunities to be involved with any sort of activities, no matter what their background was. The second piece under federal laws was the Title IX Amendment of the Educational Amendments of 1972. This was the gender issue, where the law said that no one could be excluded from doing something or being part of a team or a club or a group based on whether they were male or female. So for example, if a student wanted to play football and they were female, the Title IX amendment could cover them for that if a female wanted to play on the football team at a school that didn't have a female football team. They would have to play on the football team with males and be allowed to do that. The next piece under federal laws has to do with the Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 75, and this was a huge piece which led into what we discussed as IDEA, if you recall, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that act protected the rights of students with disabilities, and of course their parents were always covered under the legislation as well. This particular act, remember, brought into play the idea of having an assessment for students who needed services, and then they had the right to certain things under those services. That's what that law took into account. And then the last piece under federal laws here really was not specific to education, but it was called the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. That's called the ADA for short, of 90, which basically stated that there was supposed to be no discrimination against persons with disabilities. And then that act kind of paved the way a little bit more for students with disabilities in education to receive all the rights and services. So we have the U.S. Constitution as one source of school law, the federal laws as another source, number 2 of school law, and the third one are state laws. Now, if you recall, we talked about the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment said that whatever was not mentioned specifically in the Constitution would be given to the states to control. So if you recall, we said the word education was not used in the Constitution. Therefore, under the 10th Amendment, education and things related to it were given to the states to control. So this area of state laws is where we have the most laws governing education. So it's a very important piece to remember. Under these state laws, we have a variety of things. We don't need to get kind of caught up in every single state law that governs education, but if you remember the three categories here of teachers, students, and schools, you will try to remember then that there are state laws that govern teachers in reference to how they are prepared in four-year colleges. There are laws that kind of guide those programs to say teachers need this amount of credits before they can graduate, they need student teaching experiences, and so on and so forth. State laws also help to set some standards for teachers and things that they need to meet in order to get their license, which we talked about in a prior chapter. State laws also create some ethical kinds of guides for teachers, and they also, another example of state laws related to teachers is how teachers can be hired and fired, come under this domain of state laws. Students, there are state laws related to students in schools, which if you notice, these look the same categories, where textbooks and how we choose them. If you remember in another chapter, we talked about publishing companies and textbooks. And then we talked about curriculum and the 4 kinds of curriculum, the activities that schools offer, and the testing that schools do, standardized testing. We've talked about assessment in a prior chapter. So all of these kinds of categories have state laws that govern what's to be done, when it gets done, how often it gets done, such as testing. The states can govern their own education systems when it comes to these big categories, okay? However, the big piece to remember here is that over time, state laws change because people's attitudes and beliefs about what they think is important changes. So the laws kind of evolve with the way society sees things in different ways and lights and viewpoints over time, and that will impact state laws, okay? So we have the U.S. Constitution as one source, federal laws as a second source, state laws as a third source, and finally the courts are the fourth source of school law. Now, the courts are those places where decisions are made. When you hear this versus this, that's what we're talking about with court decisions. Many court cases that are currently in all the levels of the court system that we have in our country are related to things about education, student rights, teacher rights, parent rights, things going on in schools, budget issues are often in courts trying to be decided by judges. Okay, some of the biggest ones relate to religion, where there's been numerous court cases in the past about establishment clause of the First Amendment that has to do with the establishment of religion in a school. And there's something called the Lemon Test. The Lemon Test was a court case in 1971, a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, which had to do with um, how schools were either establishing religion or not. And it actually had three parts to it. So think of a lemon wedge that has like three sections. And it asked a series of questions to see if a school was actually promoting religion, which cannot be done in public schools. And on the lemon test, it would ask, is this activity or this group that wants to form, is it something that's promoting religion? Is it something that's excessively entangling government and religion, or the public and religion? And it would ask a series of questions, and it was called the lemon test. And that court case is often used as a precedent for other religious court cases that currently happen in courts. The other big issues related to court cases that we've seen are cases about desegregation, where we are trying to integrate schools more than have schools of just predominantly one race and a different school with predominantly another race in it. And one of the fastest growing areas of what we call litigation or court cases is school financing. So you might want to circle this one, because this is a pretty big area right now where schools get their money from. When there's funding given by the states, many schools feel that there's an inequity going on, where some school districts receive more money than others, and that may not be what they think is fair. So there's tons of court cases that arise related to school financing. And there's always a host of other issues where you'll see with school issues related to dress code, things the students do in school, don't do in school, that can be brought to the courts. If you remember in our curriculum chapter that we talked about, one of the issues was in the null curriculum, when we talked about issues of evolution not being taught. That has a number of court cases related to evolution, where, let's say, parents thought students should not be learning something, even if it was in science class, about evolution, and they decided to sue the school district. Now it becomes a court case related to curriculum, and it sets a precedent for future court cases. So it's a really big piece to remember about court cases. So U.S. Constitution 1, federal laws 2, state laws 3, the courts 4. Those are the 4 sources that exert influence, okay? This was part 1. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to continue with part 2. In a little while, it'll be a separate one that I'm going to record. Okay, hope you all had a great time listening.